This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Yes, you read the title correctly. After a year and a half of not touching the subject at all, we're returning to Dante once again. I have a whole playlist for the other videos, so if you're completely new to our discussion of the Inferno, then please, you may have to go back. But we are starting with Cantos VII. And my dog, if you can hear it in the background, she's incredibly excited apparently about talking about Dante, so she's with you all. So Cantos VII opens with the strange words of Plutus, this wolf-like demon. The words are pape Satan, elepe. Now, as you can tell from his name, Plutus is a concoction of different sources. Obviously, and most notably, his name is similar to the god of the underworld, Pluto, and in Greek that would be Hades. Now, because Pluto ruled the underworld, a space that contained all the mineral wealth, including gold and silver, Pluto naturally became associated with wealth and riches. Now, this Plutus is not quite man or beast, though he can speak some form of language and understand that of Virgil's, but he's described as this wolf-like, cruel animal. Now, whilst Plutus's speech may seem easily translatable, scholars are somewhat divided over the literal translation of it. It's evidently a demonic invocation to Satan, but what the words mean are contested. Pape may possibly derive from Greek papas, father, or Latin papae. But the reason people don't go towards a Latin translation is because Dante very intentionally didn't write in Latin, which I discussed in the very first video. Why it's contested not to be just the word father is because pape prepares us for the presence of something else. Popes, which is papa in Italian. Now, the popes will feature as sinners in this new circle. Elepe is also speculated to echo the Hebrew aleph, which is the divine numeral or number one, or it could also potentially be an Italian version of the word for aleph, or it references the medieval interjection alle, which is mean to "O God." Thus the meaning of Plutus's sentence has come to mean something of O Satan, God, king, but no one truly knows. All we do know is that Virgil demands him to be silent, and he and Dante pass by, unaffected by him, to enter the next circle of hell, greed, which is broken down into avarice and prodigality. Now, when they enter this circle, Dante and Virgil witness two groups of people pushing heavy boulders with their chests around a circle in opposite. So half of these people are those who are guilty of avarice, the act of holding of wealth too tightly. The other half of the people are guilty of prodigality, those who spent too freely. Now, the two groups are going around only half of the circle, and they're both travelling in the same direction. So when the two groups collide, they insult each other, and then they turn away and repeat and push the boulder in the opposite direction, only to then collide again and repeat and process. Now, Dante can't recognise any of the souls in this circle because their lives were so sordid that they are caked with filth. Yet Virgil tells Dante that among the avaricious there are many clerics, cardinals and popes. In 1 Timothy 6:10, the Bible claims that avarice is, quote, the root of all evils. And we saw in the last canto Ciacco, a fictional character serving as Dante's prophet. Now, Ciacco described avarice as one of the primary vices destroying Florence. As such, there is no sympathy spared by the fictional Dante in this realm, unlike that he showed to Ciacco and Francesca in previous circles. Yet it's in this circle of hell that Dante departs from the traditional Christian template of the 7 deadly sins by introducing prodigality. And it's here that we have to talk about Aristotle, whose Nicomachean Ethics play a huge role in this canto. But before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, which makes this possible, which is Squarespace. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience and sell anything from products to content to time, all in one place and all on your terms. I've gone through so many iterations online, from blogging to running a business, and Squarespace has seen all sides of my online evolution. Many of you have asked for me to create like a PhD academic like community space, and I could do that on my Squarespace website because it allows for me to create members only content for my community where I can sell access to online courses or blogs or videos and memberships, and purchases can be anything from a one-time fee to subscription access. And then when it comes to evolving my business, I can make smarter business decisions with Squarespace's intuitive built-in analytics tools, which lets me review my website traffic, learn where to focus my engagement, or track revenue from bookings and invoices and product sales. Again, all from one place. So if you're interested, check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And then when you're ready to launch your website, go to squarespace.com/lady of the library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, I wasn't clever enough to pick on this when I was reading it myself, so I learned about the following by reading Teodolinda Barolini's essay on Aristotle and wealth in Cantos VII. Now, they explain that here, in the fourth article, we have sinners who are both misers, i.e. those who held on to their material goods too excessively, and prodigals, those who spent their material goods inordinately. These people are both examples of excessive wealth management, which is the opposite of temperance, moderation, and continence. These people lack Aristotle's concept of virtue as a mean, because we see in their description of pushing boulders into one another again and again that each group only ever walks half the length of the circle before crushing into the other. They are opposites of the same sin of excessive wealth management. They always move towards one another, but opposing guilts divide them. With this, Dante creates an Aristotelian template within the cycle of hell. The sinners demonstrate what Aristotle identified as two extremes, vulgarity and pettiness. The mean virtue would be magnificence. Which brings us now to fortune, or fortuna depending on the translation. My translation calls it fortune, but most call it fortuna. So in detailing the members of the clergy in this cycle of hell, Virgil says, quote, "Ill-giving and ill-keeping have taken from them the lovely world and put them in this scrum. What it is like cannot be decently told. Now you can see, my son, how short a life have the gifts which are distributed by fortune, and for which people get rough with one another. So all the gold there is beneath the moon, all there ever was, could never give a moment's rest to one of these tired souls." Now, the fictional Dante does not know of this fortune of whom Virgil speaks, and so Virgil kindly elaborates upon it. Fortune, Virgil explains, is a divine figure, one which is personified as a minor female deity who has unpredictable influence on human affairs. The Romans perceived Fortuna as she who brought luck and chance, as they were inspired by Tyche, the Greek goddess of fortune. So by merging Christian and pagan ideas of fortune, Virgil describes fortune as an agent and director put in place by God. Quote, "Your science cannot take account of her. She controls, takes decisions, and executes them in her kingdom as other gods in theirs." So the classical idea of fortuna is one who arbitrarily distributes material goods amongst people, a role which would reflect Dante's concerns for a new society of his beloved Florence, where the rising wealth of the mercantile world was beginning to create tension between magnates and aristocrats. But in this section, in identifying her as an agent of God, Dante Christianizes Fortuna to diffuse the anxiety that the fictional Dante has in this book. You see, if Fortuna's actions are not capricious and instead part of a larger divine plan, there's less to fear about how the wealth of society is unfolding, because the end is ultimately good, for it is part of God's plan. Also, he argues in this. Now, for the first time in the poem so far, this canto doesn't end with this circle, but actually ends in the beginning of the fifth circle. Virgil leads Dante across the circle to another bank, above a spring which is boiling, and through a concavity. Here, the water is more black than blue, and they follow the stream down a difficult path towards a marsh called the Styx. Now, at the bottom of this sloping hill, Virgil and Dante see naked people, covered in mud and anger on their faces, striking at one another, but not just with their hands, but with their heads and their chests and their feet and their teeth, and they're tearing each other apart bit by bit. This is the introduction to the fifth circle, referenced as the circle of wrath. These are, Virgil explains, quote, the spirits of those who were overpowered by anger. And I would also like you to understand that underneath the water are people sighing. It is they who make the water bubble to the top. They gargle these hymns of sadness and rage, but they are so sunken within the swamp that their throats are filled with black filth, and they cannot get their words out properly. The Styx in Dante's Canto is both melancholic and wrathful, which we'll come to at the end of the video explaining why, but you could also see this as another nod to Aristotle's spectrum of extremes, with good temper being the virtuous middle point between these two emotions. Now we enter Canto 8 and the fifth circle of hell, wrath. So at the end of the last canto, Dante and Virgil come to the foot of a tower, which we learn in the next canto is the infernal system of communication, and a signal has been exchanged between this tower and another one further away. Now this tower is very much like the medieval structures that were found in Italy at the time, and can still be seen to this day, the most famous one being the two towers found in Bologna. The signals alert Virgil and Dante to the fact that they are not wanted, for the devils guarding the city of Dis from the towers have spotted them. Now the river Styx surrounds the city of Dis like a moat around the castle, but to make the layers clear, the Styx is actually the fifth circle of hell and the city of Dis is the sixth. And although the structure of the poem becomes less contained regarding the entering and leaving of circles of hell, this discussion remains firmly within the confines of the fifth circle, wrath, though we do refer to Dis, but keep in mind Dis is sixth. So what's most interesting about Canto 8 is that there's a shift in narrative features from the previous cantos. It is in this canto that we experience many things for the first time, such as being directly addressed by Dante in line 94, when he says, quote, "Imagine, readers, how I was discouraged to hear them speaking in this malediction." We also see multiple accounts of Dante asserting himself as a narrator. The opening line reads, quote, "To go on with my story," followed by the authorial flashback telling the reader of how long before we actually reached the foot of the high tower, where they noticed two flames at the top of the tower, so small that they could hardly see them, but these were signals. Now what's interesting is he doesn't tell us this observation the moment he makes it, he refers back to it as if he made one long before they came to the foot of the tower. So this is Dante taking narrative control, openly admitting what he does and does not want to tell us, and we see this again when we meet Filippo Argenti. Now, when we leave Filippo Argenti, he says quite openly, quote, "Here we left him, so I will say no more of him." Dante here is choosing and openly admitting that he's selecting when he wants to tell us things and what he wants to talk about and what he will not talk about. But before we talk about Filippo Argenti, I need to go back first to another discussion by a person we overlooked, which is Phlegyas, the boatsman who takes them across the river Styx. Now Phlegyas was the king of the Lapiths, a group of legendary people who lived in Thessaly. Now if you've ever seen the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum, you'll see many Lapiths fighting centaurs throughout the frieze. Phlegyas was the son of Ares, the god of war, and Chryse. Now in mythology, Phlegyas tortures the Apollonian temple of Delphi after Artemis kills his daughter at the order of Apollo, because she, his daughter, was one of Apollo's lovers, and while she was pregnant with his child, she was having an affair with another man. Now Apollo didn't want to kill her himself, so he asked his sister Artemis to do it for him. Now naturally, when the king burned down Apollo's temple, Apollo killed him and condemned him to severe punishment in the underworld. In Virgil's Aeneid, Phlegyas is shown tormented in Tartarus, warning others not to despise the gods for what they do. And as you can see in here, he is the boatsman in the river Styx. And let's move on to our next character, Filippo Argenti, who is someone Dante and Virgil spot as they are on the boat across the river Styx. Filippo Argenti is an arrogant Florentine whom Dante, the author Dante, knew and despised in real life. Now what's funny is we don't know much about this man, historically speaking. So needless to say, his insertion into the poem is a personal vendetta of Dante's. In this poem, Filippo rises up and threatens to grab the boat, but Virgil shoves him away. It is then that the wrathful souls of the Styx cry, "Down with Filippo Argenti," and they tear his flesh off with their teeth. So yes, you don't want to be an enemy of Dante, because he'll put you in a poem that people read hundreds of years later and no one knows you aside from that. So then we move on from there. The boatsman drops them off at the gates of Dis, the sixth circle, but there are over 1,000 fallen angels guarding the entrance that refuses them entry and slam the gate shut in their faces. Now, these fallen angels are quite overtly Christian devils, and you'll note here that they are stuck. In previous scenes within this book, pagan mythology is quite easy to tame. He immediately tames Cerberus, he immediately deals with any sort of pagan figures in this. But against the demons, the fallen angels, Virgil can't do anything. And that's the contrast that we need to take note of, even though it's incredibly subtle. When they close the gates of Dis, Virgil cannot do anything. Now, a detail about the city of Dis that we get into in this canto, even though we don't enter it, is that we can see the characteristics of the city from the skyline. And notably, the skyline is made of fiery mosques. You see, Dis is the infernal city, and this is characterised as Islamic, which lays groundwork for Dante's very gruesome treatment of Muhammad, who appears in Inferno 28. Yes, we're getting into deeply Islamophobic territory, and it only gets worse. How he treats Muhammad in Inferno 28, and also his depiction of fiery mosques in Dis, is actually very different, and quite a strong contrast for his positive treatment of virtuous Muslims whom Dante met in Limbo. We have Saladin, we have Averroes, and we have Avicenna. It doesn't seem that Dante has issues particularly with Muslims, but in Islam itself. You see, in Dante's Western medieval worldview, Islam was not seen as an independent religion, but as a sectarian rebellion against the Christian faith. But we'll go into more depth about that when we reach that part of the Inferno. For now, Dante has laid down the imagery preparing for that unfolding. Now, as the cantos have ceased being neat containers of each circle of hell, our discussion now blends into Canto 9. So as the pair approach the gates of Dis, Dante asks his guide if anyone wandered this far before, and Virgil replies that yes, he has. He's been down here once before, and he's been down even further. He's been down to the very lowest, darkest circle of hell, the ninth circle, and to the lowest zone of that circle, known as the Zone of Judas, and therefore he knows the path quite well. Now, Dante finds that pretty comforting, but Virgil goes on. He explains that he made the trip from the first circle to the lowest circle because he was sent on a mission to fetch a dead soul by the most foul necromancer of Roman antiquity, Erichtho. Now, Erichtho is the legendary Thessalian witch, noted for her horrifying appearance. Her most famed mention in literature is in Lucan's epic Pharsalia, in which Pompey the Great's son, Sextus Pompeius, seeks her guidance, hoping that she'll reveal the outcomes of the Battle of Pharsalus. Now, she responds to this request by gruesomely filling a corpse with potions and then raising it up from the dead, so the corpse delivers the prophecy. Now, in this poem, Dante explains that after he had just died, Erichtho conjured his dead soul and made him enter Dis in order to fetch a spirit from Judas's circle, the realm of Judas in the ninth circle. And we can get subtle implications, knowing that she's a necromancer, that she does this in order to reconnect this soul to a body in this sort of perverse resurrection. Now, before we learn any more about what happened to Virgil, from the top of the high tower, Dante sees infernal furies marked with blood rise up. They have snakes and vipers for hair and bright green hydras wrapped around their waists. Now, these creatures are the Erinyes, the chthonic goddess of vengeance in Greek mythology, Megara, Alecto, and Tisiphone. The Erinyes are more ancient than any Olympian deity, and their duty is to hear the complaints brought to them by mortals against the insolence of their fellow men and punish the culprits by hounding them. Though they sound, by description, very similar to the Gorgons, and they are very similar in nature to both Gorgons and Harpies, they're quite distinct from them. In the Eumenides, Aeschylus details how they are wingless, with hatred dripping from their eyes. These creatures also appear in Virgil Aeneid Book 7, when Juno commands the Fury Alecto to prevent the Trojans from having their way with King Latinus by marriage or besieging Italian borders. So Alecto does this by taking over the body of Queen Amata and commands the Latin mothers to riot against the Trojans. She also disguises herself as Juno's priestess Caleb and appears to Turnus, who, if anyone hasn't read the Aeneid, that's Aeneas's chief antagonist. So she appears to Turnus in a dream and she tries to persuade him to begin the war against the Trojans. But when Turnus mocks this suggestion, Alecto attacks Turnus with a torch, causing his blood to boil with passion for war, and thus he goes to war against the Trojans. Now, returning to the Inferno, the Erinyes rise up and they scream out and they call upon Medusa to turn Dante to stone. And though Virgil demands Dante cover his eyes and turn his back away, Virgil actually casts his hand over Dante's eyes for him and turns the poet away from the creatures. Now, Dante can only hear what occurs around him, and it's described as the crashing sound of troubled waves shaking the banks of the river. When Virgil removes his hand from Dante's eyes, Dante sees that more than 1,000 lost spirits are running away from the Styx, as a messenger from heaven is walking on water over it. It is the messenger from heaven who has banished the pagan creatures and protected Dante from being turned to stone. The messenger presses his baton against the gates of Dis, opening them for the travellers, but speaks solemnly to those who were infringing upon their entry, i.e. the demons, his voice full of disdain. Quote, "O you contemptible race, hunted from heaven, why does this insolence persist in you? Why are you so recalcitrant to that will which cannot ever fail of its objective, and which has more than once increased your pains? What use to run your head against the fates? Your Cerberus, if you have not forgotten, to this day has his throat and muzzle skinned." Now, this rebuttal is aimed at the inhabitants of Dis, scolding them for blocking the pilgrim's path and getting in the way of divine orders. Interestingly, this takes me back to an earlier comment that I didn't touch on at the time. See, when the Furies fly down at the pilgrims, they scream after demanding Dante to be turned to stone by Medusa, and they say, quote, "It was a poor revenge we took on Theseus." Now, likewise, when the angel messenger speaks about Cerberus or Cerberus having his throat and muzzle skinned, this alludes to the figure of Hercules. Now, both Theseus and Hercules are figures whose plundering of Hades was co-opted by Christians in the medieval period in Italy and positioned as precursors for Christ himself. Now, there's a lot of selective blurring here between Christian and pagan theology, such as this scene where the messenger enters the canto. Naturally, he's walking on water. This scene is very much also based on the ancient story of Christ's harrowing of hell after his crucifixion. But this Christ figure also functions like Mercury and Hermes, because not only is he sent as a messenger, he also bears the caduceus, the staff which Hermes/Mercury guides souls of the dead to Hades with. Now, this Christ-like figure appearing in this canto sort of highlights the gendered nature of this canto. Have you noticed that most of the pagan evils here are largely presented as female, whilst the Christian good is a male figure? In contrast to this Christ-like figure, there was the Medusa figure in particular, for she symbolises the paralysis when people believe in the wrong power. And when you think about gender, this may also have interlacing temptation of following the wrong power, as suggested by the female form. Overall, this cycle of hell demonstrates how medieval thought understood anger in two different forms. The first is that which is overtly expressed, wrath, like that of the Erinyes, or also the people fighting in the swamp. But the second is the repressed anger, the sullenness, like those souls who were stewing below the surface of the muddy swamp whose voices couldn't be heard. Anyway, this canto ends with the two pilgrims walking through the newly opened gates of Dis and into a large cemetery. The tombs are surrounded by flames, and inside the tombs, which are lidless, described as having no tops, you could hear the lamentation of wretched spirits. These, Virgil explains, are the arch-heretics. But we, and Dante, do not learn about them until we enter the next canto, and that's the beginning of the next circle of hell. But thank you ever so much for your patience for me getting to this final thing. I was just not in the best place, but we're getting there. We're getting through the cycles of hell. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing, or even supporting me over on Patreon. Thank you, as always, to my Patreons for making this possible. And more importantly, my top tier patrons. We have Glass2222, Holly is Autistic, Lacey Grindstaff, Joshua Heredia, Gil the Gilded Dragon, Lady of the Labyrinth, Ellen, Eric Taylor, Yvonne and Yvonne, Jenny Edivade, Marina, Wee Lauren, Nicholas Reed, and Andy Bazil. Thank you ever so much as always, and I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives. So keep reading.